Welcome to the IGEOS show, where we help grow the passion for an extraordinary workplace. If you're listening to or watching this, we hope to strengthen your passion for a workplace that has the potential not only to have an extraordinary impact on your life, but also on the world. My name is Amit Riker, and my co-hosts are Valerio Pascotto and Timothy Galway. Now to you, Valerio.
Thank you, Amit. What drives our efforts is really a vision and credo to enrich humaneness in the workplace. For that, we interview thought leaders who have been inspired by values of compassion, empathy, and modeling to share their discoveries, challenges, and successes. Really, there is no time like now to change the tide, from hateful divisiveness to seeking similarities, from the myth of the genius to the wisdom of humankind, and from the fears of the primitive brain to the wonder of generosity and warmth.
To support you in this work of creating extraordinary workplaces, we would like to offer you a free worksheet you can download on the 5 disciplines of a high-performance team. Just go to IGEOS.net to download the sheet and learn more about us. And now, on to our guest for today. Welcome, conscious leaders, conscious teams. My name is Amit Riker, and this is the IGEOS show. We have a fantastic guest with us today, Dr. Bob Sutton. And going to give a quick introduction with him, and then we're going to dive in and have a great conversation. So Bob Sutton is a professor of management science and engineering at Stanford, where he co-founded the Stanford Technology Ventures Program and the Hasso Plattner Institute of Design, also known as the D School. He studies leadership and organizational change, innovation, scaling, and workplace dynamics. He's published over 200 articles in academic and popular outlets, along with 7 books, including Good Boss, Bad Boss, and The No Asshole Rule, which were New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestsellers. His book, Scaling Excellence, which I have here on Kindle, which he co-wrote with Huggy Rao, is a Wall Street Journal bestseller, and Financial Times picked it as among the best 6 management books in 2014. His latest book is The Asshole Survival Guide, how to deal with people who treat you like dirt. And currently, he and Huggy Rao are focusing on the Focus Project, which he also has a podcast, the Friction podcast, and which is a multi-pronged mission to understand why companies make right things too difficult, the wrong things too easy, and what to do about it. Bob, it's a pleasure to have you. Welcome.
That's great. It's great to talk to you again, Amit. I'm delighted to be here.
Likewise. It was really fantastic to meet you at the Connected Commons event and learn about the work you're doing with the Friction Project. And before we dive into that and learn a little bit more, could you give our audience just a little bit we always like to ask, tell us about the crazy, interesting arcs with your past books, or what brought you to the current work that you're doing?
Oh gosh, so I started out. I've been at Stanford 35 years. I can't believe that the time has gone so fast. And I was for the first 20 years, a pretty traditional researcher, which means I wrote articles that nobody read, relatively obtuse academic articles. But then either I'm turning useful or dangerous, depending on your perspective, and started writing more applied, useful stuff, allegedly useful stuff. And I'd kind of say that I've got kind of 2 kind of streams of work roughly going. One are more leadership, organizational design stuff. So my first book with Jeff Pfeffer was on the knowing-doing gap, how to turn knowledge into action. And I've done a number of things in that space. The Scaling Up Excellence is the most recent. And then I've kind of got more workplace dynamics, that's sort of the no asshole rule type stuff is background. But where the organizational friction project came from, to me, there's kind of 2 prongs. The first one is, so in 2014 and even before, we were doing all these talks and all this work with companies that either had programs that would get bigger and bigger, or they just get bigger and bigger themselves. And what we kept seeing over and over again in these large organizations was that things that used to be simple would get harder to do and more frustrating. And then at the same time, to personalize this, as much as I love Stanford, having spent the lion's share of my career here, 35 years, we've gotten bigger and bigger and bigger at Stanford. And there's a lot of things that used to be really simple to do, and they just keep getting harder and harder to do. And some of them, honestly, there's, and I don't want to get in any trouble. There's probably some like financially, unethical, but financially unwise things that are now harder or impossible to do. But then there's other things that are just too difficult. And I'm in the Stanford School of Engineering, and when I first got here, we had exactly one person in the whole school who dealt with money. And now we've got, 40 of them. And the school hasn't really grown that much in terms of students or faculty. The most it's doubled. So the combination of the two led me to, and Huggy Rao, to start thinking about this organizational friction. And so we first started out, well, how do you make things easier to do? But then we realized, as I've implied here, that certain things should be harder to do. So that's kind of what this whole project is on. And you've already outlined some of the ways that we're going about studying it. But I think it might be time to stop studying it, since we have enough for 7 books. And I'm not kidding. I think 10 books.
Wow.
We should probably stop and try to write one. That might be enough.
Fascinating. So there's so many different directions we can go, but tell us about some of the findings you were sharing at the Connected Commons event. Some of the things that seem to be most driving, that have really sort of popped up in the research and the work that you're doing with the Friction Project.
Well, some of the things. First of all, there's sort of an overall frame that I think is important for understanding how people react to the problem, which is that, yes, it is partly a rational organizational design problem. So how your hierarchy is designed, how handoffs are designed, all that the procedures you use, all those sort of things are things that can cause unnecessary or necessary friction and make things harder and easier to do. So that's one part of it. But then the other part is, and since we've done this, and we even did this at the Connected Commons conference, is when we ask a group of people, well, what's driving you crazy? You get to, bless you, you get to things like, people will talk about email jail. They'll talk about how difficult it is to do. One of the things that's really been coming up a lot is people call this sort of initiative fatigue. So just to be specific, there are organizations that we work with, large famous organizations that have had consultants sell them design thinking, maybe even me. I've sold design thinking to organizations occasionally. Lean startup, which by itself, I think that Eric Ries and his gang have done a great job, and now every major consulting firm is selling agile. So that, one initiative after another comes through, and then there's this big friction problem, which is that each one carries its own language. So I had this really stupid discussion. I don't think it was an argument. I think it's a stupid discussion with somebody about what the difference is between a prototype, which is sort of more of a design thinking word, and a minimum viable product. And I think a minimum viable product is a particular type of prototype that just can barely satisfy the needs and provides a good market test. But that's the kind of conversation that I never had to have before. The difference between a minimum viable product, a prototype, and then the agile thing creates its other own language. So we're very interested in this notion that people get frustrated and it gets harder to get their work done because of some things that are rational in terms of organizational design, and then and initiative, and other things. It's just the emotional part that people just get overwhelmed, they get exhausted. And one thing that and Huggy Rao loves talking about, so there's a whole bunch of research that shows that as you put more cognitive load on people and give them more and more to do, and more to worry about, that essentially they lose the will to do what they believe is the right thing for themselves and their organization. And so that's sort of a general frame. We can talk about some of the specifics, but that's how we come at it, that it's a combination, if you will, of an organizational design problem and an emotional, even a therapy problem. And so we try to look at the emotional and the irrational parts together.
I love, there's so much juicy things that you can work with here. And this reminds me much of the work that we do with IGEOS and some of the workshops and trainings. Is this idea of what are interferences that are getting in the way
that's great.
Of your potential, which then effectively impact your performance. And that's one of the very simple sort of performance formulas that Timothy Galway had coined, one of the co-founders. And so this notion of friction or the emotional interferences, and I believe even in scaling excellence, where you and Huggy were talking about, one of the first things to do when an organization might be scaling is you need to focus on clearing the muck first, or clearing the bad first. So tell us a bit about that. And
sure. So there's a number of parts to when I think of clearing the muck. First of all, the general notion that some things are harder to do, and you should try to figure out what makes it, what be made easier. But I would even be a little bit more negative than that. And I don't mean to be negative, but
fair enough.
There's a bunch of evidence, and I think we get into a lot of details of this in the new project, but there's a bunch of evidence that when it comes to being a great person or a great organization, in some ways it's a similar problem, that bad is stronger than good. That the first, and so that reminds me of your interferences thing, that it's a lot easier to be your best self, to make things easier to do in an organization if you get rid of the bad things. So this famous academic article, very long article called Bad, it's the title, Bad is Stronger Than Good. It shows everything from bad moods to cheating. You just pick your bad thing, corruption, dysfunctional conflict versus functional cooperation. That there's all sorts of evidence that it's easier to start, it's harder to stop, it's more contagious. So in an organizational sense, that means that that the first order of business is to try to look at, what was that word you use, interferences, use the word interferences, and to try to get rid of them. So one of the things that we look for, and we can talk about some of the interferences in organizations where there's a lot of evidence that when you hand a client, a project from one person to another, and even worse, one silo to another, that's the point where misunderstanding happens. That's the point where friction builds up, because what will happen is that you think of what happens is with a waiter or waitress, sort of like throwing all the orders into the kitchen.
Right.
That friction and dysfunctional conflict builds up, and the misunderstanding. That's the case where we look for handoffs. And this is, I think that I talked about this at Creative Commons. I actually can't remember. One of the places, as you mentioned, I teach is the Stanford D-School or Design School. And there was this amazing project that two of our students did. And what they found, they were working with a large social service agency called Golden Gate Regional Center that serves disabled, the families of disabled people. And they found out that whenever people would try to sign up for the services, it would take at least 3 months. And we literally had our two students, they did this thing called a process journey, where they looked to see the places where clients got frustrated or upset or slowed down. And there'd just be frustration, being upset. And the main reason was happening is there's 8 or 9 different silos, social workers, psychologists, case workers, and so on, that it would be passed to. And they were in different buildings and different offices and didn't talk to each other, and things stacked up, and they didn't understand the whole client. And so what our students did was that they rented a Winnebago, and they put all the folks from the different silos in the bus, and they brought them out to the community, and they just have them all sit there in one place and sign people up. And they were able to do 70 or 80% of the work to sign somebody up that would usually take weeks and weeks. They're able to do that in like 20 minutes. Just with the person sitting there. And obviously the solution was not, or at least the solution was not to have people running around the community in Winnebagos. That was too expensive. And this was not something they were willing to do or pay for, but it did make the group of people of the design team, they started looking for places where handoffs and misunderstandings happened. And they thought about reorganizing their space so people could sit next to each other who handed off things a lot. And to me, that's a good example. And you can see all the emotion of like the clients being so upset. I'm tired, I'm frustrated, I'm angry. When will this ever end? And at the same time, you can see sort of the rational solutions. And to us, that would be an unusually successful friction project. And it's not like the Golden Gate Regional Center has been magically fixed, but cases rarely take more than 2 months now instead of taking 3 months to finish. So that's pretty good improvement. And to me, that would be the kind of interferences and bad things that made it possible to ease the pain in that case.
Wow. What a phenomenal example where something that seems like how much of a difference could you actually make? You throw a bunch of people in a Winnebago and you drive around town. And being,
well, I mean, that's a dramatic part of the story, but the main thing is just getting them all in one room together was, and by the way, they weren't happy when they saw the Winnebago. This wasn't like all organizational change story. It's always a little bit messy, you know?
Sure.
One other thing that's really, we're sort of fascinated with, and I'm thinking of your interferences, and these are things that you do to yourself as an executive. You don't even realize it. So we're really interested in what one of my colleagues at Stanford calls the zone of friction. So what happens to a lot of people when they have power, and there's all sorts of research to support this, that two of the most reliable things that happens when you have a hierarchy is that people below you, they flatter you and tell you how wonderful you are, and they withhold bad news from you. And this is one of those things that some executives really like that sort of flattery and don't want to hear bad news, so some executives even magnify that worse. But regardless, when you're an executive, you got to be careful. First of all, because people aren't giving you bad news about problems in the organization. They're just telling you what a great job you're doing. But the other thing that happens that's part of that is, and there's all this research that when people are in positions of power, and this works for apes too, baboons too, that the more powerful creature is watched by the less powerful. And it makes sense that attention goes up the hierarchy because, you know, when I look up, it does turn out my dean can do a lot more to me. She's just down the hall, so I better be careful. A lot more to me than I can do to her. I you know, she's power over me. She can affect my raise. She can affect my teaching load. She can put me on good versus bad committees. I mean, she can have power over my life that I can't have over her. So we look up the hierarchy. And so one of the problems with attention is this thing we call executive magnification, that executives will send out weak and unintentional signals, and then people will over magnify them, and they'll do all this work, and the executive will not even mean it. So one of the stories, I wrote a Wall Street Journal piece about this, and they didn't let me use the names of executives for some reason, but this was in confidence. So I talked to Ed Catmull, who now he's retiring, the head of Pixar and Disney Automation Studios, an amazing person. He built one of the greatest animation studios and then led an effort to turn around the even more famous one, Disney Animation Studios. Incredible guy. So he was talking about George Lucas, who he'd actually worked for years before in what became Pixar. And he said, so one time, George Lucas is kind of walking around a facility, and there was a new window. So he said, well, why is there a window there? George, just like an innocent comment. And they took this as a criticism. So the next day he comes baand they filled in the window. And George Lucas says, I didn't mean that to happen. I was just asking why there was a window. And things like that happen all the time in companies. Executives talk about resistance to change, which certainly is another kind of friction. That's when you're trying to get them to adopt design thinking or something, and they say, yes, boss, but they don't do it, that happens all the time too. But this notion of magnification, that executives unintentionally send out signals, and then boom, things change, is something also that is a source of organizational friction that we're interested in.
So in those instances, what would you say, or what have you noticed or seen in the research, I guess, both for the leaders who can be more conscientious about how to create an environment where there's a minimization of the magnification?
That's a great question, and I'm quite enamored with your phrase interferences, and it's also interesting at the Creative Commons conference we're at. There was a speaker there, the amazing Amy Edmondson. So just plug a book.
Which we had as a speaker.
I'll plug her book again. Her book is awesome. So The Fearless Organization, and Amy is, I don't know if she invented the phrase, but certainly popularized and studied the hell out of this idea of psychological safety.
Right.
A lot of it has to do with what happens when you're in power, what happens when they criticize you, they make a negative comment, and if you ignore them, you look ignored, you shut them off, that's really sort of a bad sign. But if you make it so that when they criticize something that is, one of Amy's cases is called safe to say, it really has an effect. It kind of reminds me of, and it's one of those things that it's really glib and easy to say it, but in real life, if, for the leaders who are listening, if you have a group that either had a psychologically unsafe leader or you have not been safe, they are not going to believe you for a long time. I mean, and you can change your behavior, or people who are damaged, like it takes a long time for them to get past it. And what I was thinking of is, well, in 2008, it's a long time ago, Huggy Rao and I, we interviewed Brad Bird, who also with Pixar, Academy Award-winning director of Ratatouille, all of those sort of famous movies, most famously The Incredibles, and now The Incredibles 2, which will probably win more Academy Awards. And, or if it didn't already, I think it did. I can't remember whether the Academy Awards have come for it or not. So anyway, so we interviewed Brad Bird, and it was right around the time, it was about right before I won the Academy Award for Ratatouille. But he made a film, which is a film that many people believe is one of the best animated films ever made, that didn't do too well at the box office. It's called The Iron Giant. And he took over for another director. Wow. And he described how he was like, started walking, and there's all of these animators, and they're sitting around, and he said, I told them essentially that we're going to be embarrassed together, we're going to fail together, it's safe to criticize something, and I did all of this stuff to try to make it psychologically safe, and then they just stared at me, because he said they had an abusive director before, and he said, so I started drawing on the boards, because he said we had to make the movie. So I'm drawing the storyboard, and I kept turning around, is this okay? And he said, literally, for the first 2 weeks, which is a long time, nobody ever would criticize anything that he would do. And he said, finally, 2 weeks, one person gave a little tiny, he said, well, Brett, I just have one little idea. And then he sort of magnified that and brought it out and made it safe. And that story always sort of sat with me, because even 10 years ago, I knew about Amy's stuff on psychological safety already was in the academic literature quite strongly. In this notion of what it takes as a leader, when you've got especially sort of damaged people, and maybe you've done the damage yourself, it takes a long time to repair. And I guess that's one of the things that I do worry about in this age of instant gratification. We're still human beings, and a lot of things in leadership take a long time. And some of that's where sort of the good part of friction is, that to figure that to go slow, to be persistent, and to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, that kind of thing is really difficult. And to sort of move to another area of good friction, one of the areas where bad scaling happens is when people are too impatient. And this happens all the time. Silicon Valley is like just all the time. People have like a great idea, they get it funded, and they want to just shove it into the marketplace. And we have two famous examples. One sleaze, the other one more simple incompetence. The Theranos, the amazing example, Elizabeth Holmes lying about something was ready to go and starting to scale it. But those sort of famous Google glasses. What were those things called?
I think Google Glass. Yeah,
Google Glass. That was Google it. Glass. So now the story about that, and it's in the New York Times, and I've talked to some of the people who were on the team when trying to clean it up. So what happened was you had a team in what was then called Google X that came up with this kind of cool prototype, and they figured it was years before it was ready. And their boss, Sergey Brin, comes in and says, "Yeah, let's put it in the marketplace. People are going to love this." And they're, no, it's not ready. And it turns out to be one of the worst products of all time, because it just wasn't ready. And to me, that's a case where there wasn't enough friction and he had too much power. So, and we also call that, in the book, we use the word clusterfug, F-U-G, but I would have preferred to use the word clusterfuck. But that's when leaders make bad judgment and have too much power, there's this sort of three-pronged thing that we say is a scaling clusterfuck. One is they have the illusion it's going to be easier to do than it is.
Mm.
The second thing is that they're impatient to do it quickly. And the third thing is that their incompetence turns other people incompetence. And I think that's exactly what happened with the Google Glass story. Is you had this perfectly good development team that actually came up with a product which now they're using in limited applications, actually works pretty well.
Right.
It's back in the marketplace. Like, for example, one of the good things is that have you seen they use it the doctors use it?
I've been hearing about where trying to supplement it a little bit with augmented reality, with either studying cases or something.
Yeah. So one of the things that they do is that when they're talking to a patient, a lot of times with the what do you call it, the patient medical record software, they're typing in and not even look at you, so they can look at you and then the advice and stuff, and they even can talk. It's kind of all being recorded by somebody somewhere who's typing up the notes and putting the stuff in creating the medical record and actually looking you in the eye. So that's actually a pretty good use of it. So it is coming back in the marketplace. But to go back to the story, or the thing that's one of the things that we look for, where we talk about having too much friction is certainly a problem sometimes. And there's lots of cases of great products that languished at the bottom of hierarchies or were stuck in silos for literally decades that should have gone into the marketplace. But when you don't have enough friction, you end up with stories like Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos and Google Glass. So you do need some friction sometimes.
Tell us a little bit more about, I believe you had brought it up in your presentation at the conference, and then also a little bit in one of your last podcast episodes about when is friction good, particularly decision-making or creativity. Tell us a little bit more about that.
I think of friction being good for one is to make it just to stop bad things. I mean, it should be really hard for people to steal. If you've got norms against stealing or lying or cheating, if when they do that, they know the world's going to come down on them. That's not the worst thing in the world. So that's one. The other thing, which we've talked about, and our snide line is to scale excellence. You must have excellence to scale. So both those examples that we just talked about are a case where in creativity development, you actually have to develop something excellent before you can spread it. And the more expensive, some things, and although it's interesting now, in the early days, something like Facebook, when they were sort of quote unquote just sort of a dating site, then making little mistakes wasn't such a big thing. Although it turned out they needed more friction more early. But if you're doing something like one of the examples that I've used in some of my talks is that I was talking to folks at VMware, which is a software firm here, I said, do you move fast and break things? And they said, no, especially in our software that we use for nuclear submarines, that has to be perfect before we launch it. That's where you want some friction. You want to make sure that the product is developed perfectly. And there's one other time which, and I don't want to say that cults or anything are great, but there's all of this research that shows that the more effort you put into something, the more valuable it is. So if you want to create commitment among employees, then, I'm not arguing for hazing or sleep deprivation, although that works because every military in the world does it. But, making it so that somebody's got to go through multiple rounds of interviews, even though if you're going to hire them, it's going to increase their commitment than if they just do one interview. I mean, things like that. And also the people in the organization, because they work harder, will be more committed to making the person succeed. So a little friction there, even ritualistic friction might be good. And then there's great academic research on this. It turns out that the IKEA effect is real, that the more time that people will spend actually assembling some IKEA box or furniture or something, the more time they spend, the more their own money they're willing to spend on it. So they'll pay much less for a box that somebody else assembled than one they assembled for themselves. So, I mean, those are just some examples, but some of the times when friction is good. So commitment, getting things right, making bad things hard to do. Oh, the one other time we also like to talk about is that you can use friction to make it hard to add friction. So sort of like a jujitsu type thing. And the example we like to use there, I'm looking at his book. That's why I'm looking over there. There's a guy named Laszlo Bock, wrote a great book. Did you interview Laszlo too?
Well, we have not. No.
He is. He's now doing a startup. So Laszlo wrote a book called Work Rules. He was. He was basically head of HR, but they had some other term at Google for at least 10 years, and very, very evidence-based kind of guy.
Right.
But what happens in a company like Google, and Google really, was and is a great company, but they had these kind of early traditions to really, really focus on hiring and to make it hard for people. And it used to be that, and I just was talking about doing multiple interviews, but there's a point where it's just insane. Right. I mean, they would do 14, 16, 18, 20 interviews, which might have been made sense in some cases, but what happened is, as Google just has honestly become just another company in Silicon Valley and not nearly as cool as many of them. Well, if after the 7th interview, they just give up and they go to Airbnb or something, which is paying them more and it's pre-IPO, so they might, so you're going to lose them. So what Laszlo did was, after hearing this was more and more of a problem, is he put in this really simple bit of friction, which was that if you were going to interview somebody for the 5th time, it was going to be the 5th interview, then 5 people interviewing them, then you just had to write him an email and ask for permission to do it. That was the whole thing. So very light friction. And he said that excessive interviews stopped almost immediately.
Wow.
Because there's not usually magical things that work. But just the idea of making things that are dumb to do harder to do, I think, is another time to use friction. But I don't want to say too much good about friction. I'm worried that we're going to a great place. There's lots of ways in which it sucks, and when people are exhausted, they're frustrated. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why friction just drives people nuts. So I like to focus on the negative more. You're making me more sunny than I actually.
More sunny. Okay, so let's go there then, because you talk about. Not surprising with some of the titles of your other books and whatnot. So we can see where you like to really dive in. One of the topics I believe you had mentioned, you talked about the friction battle never ends. So,
that's a good one. There's this notion for those of us who are into building physical objects, we sometimes mistake them for organizations that, sort of like, I don't know, you'll design or build a car or a computer and it's done. It's like, that's it. But organizations are living entities. They're much more like nature in lots of ways. And so what happens in organizations that will do programs to get rid of bad procedures or rules or whatever, that they'll have like a stupid rule contest. There was a bank that I used to work with that had a stupid rule contest and actually did a pretty good job of getting rid of some pretty stupid rules that frustrated customers in particular. But then they stop it and they don't do it again. And so this notion, it's like mowing the lawn, is really important. And probably the example that I like to use is with Dropbox. In about 2013, Drew Houston, who's the CEO, and others figured out that people were spending more and more time in meetings. The meetings were bigger and bigger, and they were missing ship dates. So what they did was they sent everybody in the company an email that said, "Our meeting-geddon has landed." And what our meeting-geddon was, they went into everybody's calendars and they just removed all standing meetings except with customers. And they couldn't re-enter any standing meetings for 2 weeks. And they came up with also these rules like if you're in a meeting and you're not being useful, you should leave, and meetings should be as small as possible and so on. And I'm not saying that all meetings are bad. It just becomes a disease like anything else. But so that was in about 2013. And it took us, Rebecca Hines, the woman I wrote this up with, it took us about 2 years to finally get approval for it. And so we went to see Drew in about 2015, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, that was really useful, but it's like the lawn. If you mow it once, that's not enough." So that's sort of where that story comes from. But the whole friction thing, and it is funny that there's 2 things that are going on here. One is you got to fight it every day, and you also have to have like the self-awareness to get the bad news to the executives and people in power to actually do something about it. Those are, I think, some of the themes. That's why I like Amy's work so much on psychological safety. You always sort of go back to that. And one thing I do admire about Drew, who is really, I think, one of our better startup CEOs who started early, is that he's somebody who is a very good listener and kind of wants the bad news. That's one thing. He has that reputation. I think that he earned it.
That's fantastic. I'm loving the overlap, because you mentioned about awareness. That's another big part in the work we do of really having that non-judgmental awareness, and that one of the things we say is particularly in teams, clarity migrates. That if the big aha came from one person at one moment, it may come from another person. It's not always the person in charge or the leader and whatnot. And that's why we talk about it from that aspect. And just hearing these stories, very concrete examples of how that can either break down certain initiatives or whatnot is really fascinating.
So that's really interesting. So one of the themes that runs through a lot of my work that is consistent with that is that one of the problems with being a leader, having more power or more status than people, is that even if you do nothing or say nothing, still you can dampen the safety in the room to say what you want. And there's and I wrote a blog post about this somewhere. There's this thing that I call management by walking out of the room. And this notion that sometimes by just withdrawing from the room, the really powerful person, that sometimes they can make better decisions. And there's a famous case, actually, and I've written about this in the Bay of Pigs, and for probably most of the people who are watching this are too young to have been around during the 19.
I think we may have a broad audience, but yeah. Please go on.
But the United States almost went to war with Russia over nuclear missiles in Cuba. And there was all of this debate in then President John Kennedy's cabinet and advisors about essentially whether to attack them, whether to negotiate them, what should we do? And so what Kennedy did is he realized that his stature would sort of undermine the debate and stifle people. So he broke them into two different groups and had his advisors had them, argue about what to do. And then he left and just let them go for like a couple hours and had them come back with different recommendations, which did two things. It kind of got rid of the groupthink of all being in one group, and it also removed his powerful presence from the room. And some of the greatest executives that I know do that. And it's, by the way, especially important in cultures that are sort of more authoritarian, where the more powerful people will leave the room. Many years ago, IDEO did some work with Samsung. This was so long ago that Samsung was viewed as sort of like a crappy Me Too brand, and Sony was viewed as great, and they wanted to be as good as Sony. And now things have definitely flipped. But they were trying to figure out how to get work done in creative teams who were actually in Palo Alto, and they're all Koreans. And they kept noticing that the more powerful people would stifle the younger, lower status people, but they didn't really fix it until a young guy named Dan Kim, Korean American, actually, I think he moved back to Korea. Eventually, he said, well, the problem is the power differences, and they just pull the managers and executives out of the room and just have the peers do the design work and then present it later. And so that's one of those things that people who are in power sort of unconsciously, they're not even aware of the effects they have. Sometimes they have it on purpose on a power trip, and they love that shit. And that's like a whole nother problem. That's where you got like the narcissists and the egomaniacs, which there's plenty of in powerful positions.
That's when we'll go to your book on the
assholes. Yeah, well, there's all different kinds of assholes. There's also unintentional assholes, but we can talk about that. But power can do very bad things to people's minds at times.
Wow. So where do you see now now that you mentioned that you have enough material to write 7 books, or is this a sore topic? We can pass it along.
No. So it's just one of those things that if you want to, we can work together on the book proposal, because that's one of the secrets for people out there. If you're going to write a book, especially the way the book business works, is that the book's nice, but they buy the proposal, not the book.
Right.
So my literary agent, she reads my proposals really carefully, gets the hell out of them. Christy Fletcher, she's really good. But I don't even know whether she reads my book, because that's incentives work. And so we're trying to structure the proposal. So some of the things that are big things you've heard of me here, that friction, there's good and bad. It's part therapy. It's part organizational design, and we're doing things like leader behavior, organizational design. Oh, one of the things that I think is worth talking about, because we have a brand new case that wasn't even released when I first met you a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
So one of the things we're really interested in is when you put on a time horizon on friction, that it's sort of like debt. That there's some things that allow you to move really fast for a while, but if you don't deal with them, then kind of everything blows up. So it's literally like you go into debt so you can afford to live in that house. Yeah, that works as long as you make the regular payments. But if you don't make the payments, eventually they take your house away from you, right? Or you're, and so to use in the case that we just finished, and we'll get it more wider release. We're trying to figure out what to do with it. It's on Uber, and our main protagonist, if you write a teaching case, there's a guy named Tuan Pham. Tuan, not off the record, but it's publicly available. He's been there for about 4 or 5 years, which is longer than anybody in the senior management team. Everybody else has left or been fired. He's head of engineering, and it's about both the things they did. So a lot of it's about things that they did so they can move fast that they're now trying to fix, in addition to some of the more ethical and cultural stuff that we've been talking about. They did a whole bunch of things that were just organizational. I'll just give you 2 examples that they can move fast now, but now they got to literally hit the brakes and slow down and fix them. So the friction, it's sort of like the friction is coming back to haunt them. One was that to be able to develop software modules really quickly, they divided in what they call decentralized microservices. So there were all these little Lego pieces, and they had this motto of letting builders build, which was great to allow the teams to move fast, but there is not enough coordination among them. And so they had all these different programming languages, and people wouldn't. So now they're having to figure out how to fix that. And another thing they did was to hire people real quickly. They hired a bunch of people who were fresh out of school, who weren't experienced enough, and they actually ended up doing an 18-month moratorium on hiring people who were straight out of school, because they had so many inexperienced people, especially in engineering, who actually then, by the way, became managers really quickly, because the best way to get a raise was to become a manager, and they needed managers. So they had all these first-time managers leading these first-time employees, and that was, and they were supposed to be left alone to work on their own team. So it's literally all this friction, all these problems occurred in terms of reputation, coordination, just because they didn't have enough controls, which was great for a while, but eventually it's terrible. So that's another thing that we're trying to work out in the book is how we put in the time dimension in terms of friction. So that's some of this. And we also, and the final thing, which is Rob Cross was involved in that conference. It was his conference on the Creative Commons. So Rob and I, and then one of my former students, Rebecca Hines, and I, we're trying to look at grease people and gunk people. So the people in an organization who make things easier to do, right, who get in the way. So that's another thing we're sort of looking at is why do some people be sort of the people who are, like, we call them rule Nazis, who always say no and you can't do that, and versus the people who are really good at, like, lubricating the system and moving things along. So that's grease people and gunk people is another sort of thing. So you can see if we seem to have pieces of a book outline. We just have to start writing it. You have noticed about books, if you don't write, they don't get written.
Certainly. Well, Bob, this has been fascinating, and I could just keep talking about all sorts of things. But as we're sort of wrapping up our time here, what are some things with all the really fascinating aspects that you're working on, either with Friction Project, so for a community that you would really like for us to take away of something, either last words to share with us?
Oh, that's interesting. So there's a couple of things that I've been thinking about, and I don't think this is a wrap up of my whole work. I mean, if you're going to do sort of a headline of my work, I think it's something like "Work doesn't have to suck." Sometimes it does, but there's something you can do about it. But some of the folks in your audience, I have this thing, 15 things I believe, that's on my blog and stuff like that. And I've been fooling around with that. And I kind of got a new one I'm kind of fascinated with, and I'm looking for examples of. And it's this notion, it's contrary to how my mother raised me, so that's also, even though I'm like 64 now, which is that not everything worth doing is worth doing well. And there are some situations. So I just think of some of I won't name them, some of the procedures I have to go through at Stanford, that paying no attention to what's in the form at all, barely filling out the boxes, just getting it signed so we can go to the next stage. And there's probably some lawyer somewhere who's going to be upset at me. But honestly, if I read everything carefully I was supposed to read through Stanford, I'd spend my entire life reading forms. And there's also times where you just have to just sort of move along because it doesn't really matter. And so I'm really interested in cases where that's actually true and when it's actually dangerous, because you don't want to have a doctor who's operating on you who believes that everything worth doing is not worth doing well during the operation and telling them that while they're sewing you together. There's times when it's obviously really important, but what is the stuff that the doctor should just sort of, if you will, check the box or do the rubber stamp so that he or she can really concentrate on doing what's important well. So that's my latest motto, and I'm looking for examples that everything worth doing is not worth doing well.
Oh, fascinating. Well, Bob, tell us where we can learn more about your work or other books that you'd like to, with this book that is going to be coming out.
Well, I better write. Huggy Rao and I better write it first. So I mean, you will put in plenty of plugs for my stuff, and I think you've done enough already. But for me, in terms of things that are fascinating, if I was going to sort of say to two books that are a little bit surprising, you wouldn't necessarily expect for people who watch your show. And I have a list of some of my favorite management books, but two of my favorite ones are completely different. One's really long, one's really short. There's a book called A Path Between the Seas by the historian David McCullough. It's about the building of the Panama Canal. And it is the craziest story of, talk about doing something at scale that's really, really hard. And it's just an amazing story. It's one of the best stories about leadership, management, sleazy politics. It's all in there. Revolutions, the United States sort of fomented a revolution so they could get the canal built, all this crazy stuff. And then on the other extreme, there's a book, oh gosh, I'm going to forget the name of the author. He's now dead. I remember that. It's called Orbiting the Giant, Gordon Mackenzie's his name. Orbiting the Giant Hairball. That's the name of the book. And it's how to essentially survive and be a creative person in a stifling bureaucracy. And his job was for many years, he was called the creative paradox at Hallmark greeting cards. It's just one of my favorite books about how, if you're trying to be a creative person and survive and navigate a bureaucracy, the stuff that you need to do. So those are just two weird books that I would recommend that are not sort of in the modern conversation. They're sort of back there in history.
Wow, I love it. Thank you so much, Bob. Bob Sutton here. We've got, check out his books, amazing mix of stuff, his articles on his blog as well. And then those two books that you recommended, I'm really curious to check those out. So,
yeah. Orbiting the Giant Hairball takes a lot less time than A Path Between the Seas.
Wow. So, Bob, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. And conscious leaders, conscious teams, thanks for being with us on this conversation as we continue with other thought leaders and industry leaders. So my name is Amit Riker with the IGEOS show, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.
Thanks, Amit. It was great to talk to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you for joining us today. We have many more exciting thought leaders to come on this show. If you enjoyed this interview, please click the like button and also subscribe so that you can stay tuned to learn from other powerful thought leaders in future shows. We would also appreciate your comments and feedback on the show, as well as who else you would like to hear from. And don't forget to visit our site, IGEOS.net, to download the free worksheet on the 5 disciplines of a high-performance team. See you next time.